Well, good morning, everyone from Azusa, California. I'm Laurie Schreiner, and I'm chair of the Department of Higher Education here at Azusa Pacific University, and we're delighted to have you join us through the wonders of technology today. Before we begin the webinar, however, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the passing of a giant. Last night, Representative John Lewis from the state of Georgia passed away. An icon of the civil rights movement, one of the original freedom riders, a tireless activist for voting rights. John Lewis represented not just the state of Georgia, as he was reelected to Congress 16 times, but the conscience of a nation. Listen to his words this morning. "Do not get lost in a sea of despair," he wrote. "Do not become bitter or hostile. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. We will find a way to make a way out of no way." Rest in power, sir. The Department of Higher Education at Azusa Pacific University has been sponsoring the Critical Issues in Higher Education seminar since 2007, when Adriana Kizar was our inaugural speaker. The purpose of these seminars is to expose our doctoral students and the broader university to significant issues that are confronting higher education, as seen through the lens of key scholars in our field. Since our first seminar in 2007, we've had as our guest Albert, who was the General Counsel for the U.S. Department of Education, John Tagg, Bill Tierney, Mitch Chang, Darnell Cole, Alyssa Rockenbach, Susan Comavez, Daryl Smith, Sean Harper, Alexander Aston, and Julie Park, presenting on wide-ranging issues that reflected their expertise. And today is no exception, as we welcome one of the foremost experts on Hispanic-Serving Institutions, Dr. Gina Ann Garcia. Dr. Garcia will have 2 sessions today of about an hour each, and following her first presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers using the chat feature. Please type your question, as all of you are muted for this webinar, and I will facilitate a period of questions and answers following her first presentation. Then we will take a break and start our second session promptly at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And that session will also conclude with an opportunity for questions and answers through the chat feature. And now I'd like to invite Dr. Christopher Newman, Associate Professor of Higher Education here at APU, to introduce Dr. Garcia.
Thank you, Laurie. Dr. Gina Ann Garcia is a leading scholar of Hispanic-Serving Institutions. She is also an associate professor in the Department of Administrative and Policy Studies at the University of Pittsburgh, specializing in higher education and student affairs. She is a scholar activist committed to disrupting the status quo of post-secondary education by bringing attention to the ways higher education has historically been committed to whiteness and regularly reinforces white narratives and white standards. Connecting critical and organizational theory, Dr. Garcia's research centers Latinx's and HSIs and is guided by the principles of equity and justice. Dr. Garcia's work has been recognized by prominent organizations and foundations. She was the recipient of a Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellowship in 2016 and a National Academy of Education Spencer postdoctoral fellowship in 2017. In the spring of 2018, she received the Early Career Scholar Award from the American Education Research Association's Hispanic Research Issues SIG. And in the fall of 2018, she was the recipient of the Association for the Study of Higher Education's Council for Ethnic Participation's Mildred Garcia Award for Exemplary Scholarship. Notably, she is the author of Becoming Hispanic-Serving Institutions, Opportunities for Colleges and Universities, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. Dr. Garcia is a public scholar committed to advocating with and for HSIs, and with the goal of transforming colleges and universities that enroll the most compositionally diverse students. As a former student affairs practitioner, Dr. Garcia draws on her own experiences to guide her research and practice. She was the coordinator of a Department of Education Developing HSIs Title V grant at California State University, Fullerton, where she developed retention initiatives for students in science, math, and engineering. She also held a position funded by the National Science Foundation grant, working with a community college transfer students who wanted to major in science and math. She graduated from UCLA with a PhD in higher education and organizational change, and from the University of Maryland, College Park, with a master's degree in college student personnel. Dr. Garcia is the product of an HSI, California State University Northridge, and is motivated by her own experiences taking Chicana X studies courses as a resident assistant working in residence life, and as a sister of Lambda Theta Alpha Latin Sorority Incorporated. Gina is one of the most energetic people that I know. I'm so excited to introduce Gina because we go way back to the days of UCLA, where we actually sat next to each other as bay mates. And for those that aren't familiar with the STEM lingo, that means that we were like lab partners or lab mates, as we both worked as research analysts at the UCLA Higher Education Research Institute under the direction of Dr. Silvia Hurtado. I was technically 1 year ahead of Gina, and I was assigned to be her mentor. And I think that lasted for about 2 meetings, and our relationship quickly oscillated between mentor and mentee roles. We have worked together ever since. She has a chapter in my recently published co-edited volume on multiculturalism in higher education. She's an activist scholar, a colleague, and a friend. Please join me in giving Dr. Gina Garcia a warm APU Zoom webinar welcome, where we can't hear you clap, but I'm going to clap for everyone. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Gina Garcia.
Thank you, Dr. Newman, my really good friend who I've known a really long time. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to APU for this invitation. When I got the invitation a long time ago, I feel like that y'all invited me probably last fall, I was honored and also a little overwhelmed because I knew the list of people who had given this talk prior to me. So people who I admired, who had mentored me, you know, Sean Harper, Alexander Aston, Adriana Kizar, people who I think of as giants in the field of higher education. And it was just an honor to know that I was being invited to rise to that level and to be able to give a talk about higher education and where we're at in higher education. I see I'm a little bit delayed, so if at any point y'all can no longer hear me, just like let me know. I know the moderators will let me know, but it seems to be a little bit delayed. But I'll do my best. I guess that's part of Zoom. I am coming to y'all live from Pittsburgh, so I'm in a whole different time zone than y'all. And I do wish I could be there because there's so many people that I know are listening in, who I know and who are friends and who have also mentored me and been really great colleagues along the way. So hello to all of y'all also, and hopefully I'll get to hear from y'all at some point throughout the day. So as we get into this, I'm going to talk probably for about 35 or 40 minutes about my book. Here's the book cover. We will move through Prezi. Partially why I think I'm a little delayed is because Prezi takes up a lot of space too. And so it moves through in interesting ways. But I will talk for about 35, 40 minutes, and then I'll let y'all ask questions. And I'm going to, things that I'm thinking about that we should be thinking about right now, I'm going to bring into, because obviously I wrote this book a couple years ago. It was published in 2019, but even just the ideas come from several years ago. So I'm going to talk about how we can use the book even today, and particularly around some of the issues we are grappling with right now, and specifically about racial justice and how are we going to get to racial justice? I'm sure many of y'all like me have received many, many, many emails about people's commitments and institutions' commitments to Black Lives Matter, to elevating Black lives, to being committed to racial justice. And that's great, but I think at the end of the day, we need to see action, right? Like when and how are we going to see that actually happen? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And when I talk about the book and talk about whiteness, and our connection and our commitment, what I call our commitment, our attachment to whiteness, I want us to think about, are we committed and how do we remain committed? And how are we going to disconnect ourselves from always valuing whiteness? Because until we do, it's going to be really hard to actually get to racial justice for people of color. And so I'm going to leave that with y'all as I move through the presentation to really think, reflect as I go through, reflect on your own practices, how we reinforce and how we value whiteness. My information is there at the bottom, so you can always feel free to also tweet me at Gina Ann Garcia. I don't know that I'll respond right at this moment, but I definitely will respond eventually. So in the book, I start out with this idea that there's this dominant narrative that it's going to be really hard to change until we can address that dominant narrative. And that dominant narrative, of course, is around whiteness and how we are committed to whiteness, and how HSIs, as what I call racialized institutions, are never going to be elevated to the level of the most elite organizations in the country until we actually grapple with whiteness, until we actually, decide how we as institutions value this. And so I talk about this and I frame this in the book around this idea of racialization of post-secondary institutions. Now, when I first set out to write the book, racialization and everything I knew about racialization was at the individual level. That we understand that people as racialized individuals, that it's constructed, right? It's socially constructed. And many of us, believe in that. We believe in this idea that race isn't biological. The way people treat us in this country, particularly in the United States, is based on this social construction and what we believe of people's race and what we believe of who they are based on just, what we see and how they perform and how they show up in our spaces. So as I started to think about institutions, I used the same idea of racialization to think about, well, how are we doing that to HSIs? How are we doing that to institutions that are HSIs because of the students of color within their institutions, right? And the only reason that HSIs are actually HSIs is because there is a majority of the population actually is people of color. And so for me, I started really grappling with, how do we take that to an organizational level? And what does that look like to think about made up racial categories and the valuing of institutions based on a construct, right? And that we have to grapple with that before we can actually come to really believe in HSIs. I've heard different narratives about HSIs and whether or not they are HSIs, are they Hispanic enrolling, and also whether we believe they're actually quote unquote good institutions. And I use quote unquote because that's socially constructed too. What we believe to be the best institutions in the country is socially constructed, and in many ways connected to this idea of race. And I'll talk about that as I move through the slides. And so for me, I talk about racialization of colleges and universities creates this hierarchy. And I pull on Alexander Aston's work, and I think I have a couple slides in thinking about how Alexander Aston has really challenged us to think about the stratification of higher ed and what that looks like for us to value the most selective institutions in the country while leaving behind the broad access institutions, which is community colleges, right? In California, obviously the California Community College enrolls predominantly people of color and predominantly Latinx in particular, depending on what part of California you're in. And so this stratification happens where we value the most selective institutions and we devalue the more broad access institutions. And so I frame this around a racial lens about what happens with those most valued institutions and those most selective racially institutions, if we really start to think about the race of those institutions, many of them are what I call in the book racially white institutions, or what many of us call predominantly white institutions, right? That they are that the largest enrollment is white people, but at the same time, structurally, they continue to operate in white ways. And then the devaluing of racially minoritized institutions, inclusive of HSIs, but also HBCUs and other racial minority-served institutions such as tribal colleges. So the consequences for me, as I have been grappling with HSIs and their value and their place in a larger society, in a larger system of higher ed, is that they're undervalued, right? A lot of the work as I got into, and Dr. Newman talked about our time at UCLA, most of my thinking, a lot of my thinking about this was happening right there as we sat side by side in our lab, right, in our research lab. I was grappling with all this stuff of like, why are HSIs not valued? And why is everything I'm reading saying that they're not good, or that they're only Hispanic enrolling? And why, when I conduct my own quantitative research, am I finding the same things, right? And am I reinforcing a negative narrative when in reality, I think HSIs have a lot of potential, right? That's what I was thinking back then, is like, they have a lot of potential, but the numbers are telling us that they're not good, right? If we only value the numbers, then we sort of miss other things and other opportunities that are going on with these institutions. So in the book, I talk about all these ways in which we value whiteness. And I felt like that was important because it's easy to say, hey, we have these white normative standards, or we value whiteness, but I had to lay it out, right, in a way where people could really come along with me. And the book is written in narratives. There's 3 chapters of narratives. They're counter narratives. They're stories. I tell stories. And so in chapter 1, I really wanted y'all to come along with me and to believe, like, yes, we agree. We are with you, Gina. We are ready to go on this journey with you. And so I laid out all these different ways. And so those of you who are teaching, right, in the higher ed program at Azusa Pacific, this is something for y'all to think about as far as like whose knowledge is in the classroom. And I think about this all the time. I literally count, like, okay, how many Black authors do I have in my syllabus? How many Latinx? How many queer? How many transgender or gender nonconforming? I mean, I look at all these different ways and try to find, and it is hard to find those narratives. Honestly, they're not always, because the dominant narrative is the white narrative. And so I really challenge y'all to think about, like, what are you teaching, and are you continuing to teach the white narrative, right? I teach the history of higher ed, and these core books come up over and over again in history of higher ed syllabi. I don't teach any of these books, but I think they're important. I think they've said some important things, but I don't teach them, right? I teach different narratives. Organizational theory, which the book draws on, predominantly white knowledge created by white scholars with white institutions, and oftentimes created by, with people within the institutions, white people. And some of the leading research in higher education, the research that many of us, like our foundational work and we draw on, was developed by white scholars in white institutions and with white participants, with white students. And so the narrative becomes white around whiteness, right? The knowledge being created is around whiteness. So this is something for y'all who get to decide what knowledge is taught in your classroom and what knowledge is taught in the program, even in the higher education program. How much are you valuing whiteness, and how much are you starting to disrupt that? Because this is the reinforcement of this white narrative. The more we reinforce it, the more it continues to play out, and we go out and we continue to act and we be practitioners around these white narratives and these white ways in which we value higher education. This starts to play out in practices, and I lay this out in many different articles about what do the practices look like. And I draw on this article by Dr. Lori Davis Patton, who basically lays out all the ways in which we continue to uphold white structures, right? And that when we uphold white structures, it privileges white students, and it silences all the rest of our students, right? It silences students of color, and their experiences, and many times marginalizes, trivializes, and or just is microaggressive towards our students. White standards in the book I lay out, and this was really like a lot of thought went into like, well, what are white standards, right? And how do we value them in higher education? And selectivity is one of them, right? Selectivity is one of the ways in which institutions gain traction and gain selectivity in this hierarchy of higher education. And Alexander Aston lays this out beautifully in his book, Are You Smart Enough? That book like was so powerful for me. When I bought that book, I actually heard him speak about it at ASH one year, and I immediately bought it and read it from beginning to end as quickly as possible because it made a lot of sense. But it was essentially race neutral, right? What I call race neutral. It didn't have a racial narrative, right? So I buy it. I buy what he's saying about like us valuing smart students, which is a reflection of grades, which I love what's going on right now of this pushback on whether or not we're going to even require SATs and ACTs scores, because that's one of those white standards, right? So if your institution has already said we're not going to value those things, you are already pushing back on those white standards, and it's starting to happen, at much larger levels to the point where we're probably going to see less and less institutions using those scores and or GPA as like the indicator of how smart students are, because we know they're not foolproof, they're not fully objective, and they are a reflection of students' broader experiences in the educational system and their experiences in society, really, their experiences with oppression. So we're pushing back on that. Where I don't see as much pushing back is how we value quote unquote smart faculty. And smart faculty in Aston's book, he talks about the more research dollars you bring in and the more high-level publications. And this one is funny because I always push back on this right after, 20 minutes before, 15 minutes before, hearing this narrative about all these ways in which I've achieved as a quote unquote smart faculty member, right? I've gotten publications and awards and whatnot. And that's what's valued in our system, but it's what I call the white normative system, right? And how do we start to disrupt that and really think about what do we value over that, right? And how can we start to rethink what is the most important thing to us as an institution? Rankings, of course, we know for a long time, people have been saying rankings are not the best indicator of anything, yet we continue to use them, right? And it's interesting because, at UCLA, we often pushed back on rankings, yet the minute UCLA higher education program is number one, guess what tweets and guess what emails and guess what everything we're getting? We're getting that information, right? Immediately, yay, UCLA higher education program is like number one in the rankings for X, Y, and Z type of institution. And I'm like, really? Because I thought we didn't really value those things, or I thought we knew that those weren't the best indicators of anything. Yet when we are the top or the number one, then we want to tout it, right? And we want to say, okay, we're at the top. Peer evaluation, we know, is subjective. It's not a really objective measure. Graduation rates, of course, are a reflection of our students' backgrounds, right? Their SES, their high school of origin, their mother's education level, and their scores. These are all things that if you put into a quantitative model will be the best indicators of whether or not they get into school and also whether or not they graduate from higher education. So as I was thinking about HSIs and how we're valuing them, all of these things to me started to make sense why HSIs were undervalued. I'm like, well, if these are the things we value, HSIs are never going to be highly valued in a system that values these things, or what I call in the book, white normative standards. And then we see this play out as we start to think about graduation rates. If graduation rates, I'm never going to say they're not important. I mean, of course, we want to graduate students and we want them to get out. But what we know is that because graduation rates are connected to students' incoming demographics, those demographics I talk about, that those students who go to more broad access institutions, of course, those graduation rates are going to be a little bit lower because they're going to broad access institutions for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they want to stay close to home. Sometimes they, went to high schools that encourage them to go right into those broad access institutions. The high school of origin makes a difference. There's lots of indicators of whether or not they'll go to a broad access institution versus a selective institution. Yet those most selective institutions have the highest graduation rates. And broad access institution, which many HSIs are, have much lower graduation rates. So again, this narrative around why HSIs are undervalued starts to make a lot of sense. It's like, well, yep, they're connected to all these variables that we know what's going to happen in broad access institutions. There's a good number of reports that also show that selective institutions, Carnevale and friends over there at Georgetown, they've produced a couple reports that show those most selective institutions are also enrolling the highest percentage of white students, right? Like white students continue to go into those selective institutions. And so it reinforces this narrative. The HSI average graduation, by the way, is 39%. So it does fall into this, lower level. The average for all institutions is about 54%. And then the most selective institutions is up there in the 70 to 88% range. So, we have to think about these and be critical of these things that we value in higher education, because if we don't think critically about them, then it's easy for us to say, well, these institutions are underperforming because, well, look at their graduations, 39% graduation rate, without thinking about the narratives and the people within them. And at this point, I like to bring in, well, who are those students, right? Who are the students at HSIs? And we know the profile of students at HSIs is much larger percentage of students of color. A majority of HSIs have a higher percentage of students of color than they have white students. There was a moment where it was sometimes 50-50, or where folks are saying HSIs are still predominantly white. That's not the case. There's data that came out of ACE, American Council of Education, last year, a report about race, and it shows that a majority of HSIs actually enroll a larger percentage of students of color than white students, because that includes Black, Asian American, Native American, and Latinx students, not just Latinx students. So when you think about that, yes, you have the most, largest population of students of color in HSIs, a majority low income. Just by the nature of the designation, the institution has to enroll at least 50% low income anyways. So the nature of the designation is you're going to have lower income. And as I noted, income is an indicator of whether or not students are going to graduate. Right? So if you're bringing in low income students, we've got to be critical of okay, that's going to be an indicator of our graduation rates. And if that's the only thing we value, guess what? Our graduation rates are going to probably be lower just because of the nature of the system, right? In which low income students have made their way into higher education through. First generation to college, first generation to the US, maybe part-time enrollment, underprepared for college, underprepared in quotes based on scores, really, because maybe they are prepared, but the scores might say they're not, even if they are. I always think about my test scores when I entered Cal State Northridge and I placed into developmental math and developmental English. So I was one of those students that didn't do well on the test and therefore had to take my first semester in those developmental courses. I don't regret taking those courses, but I also like to remind people that I, obviously became successful in the educational system just by the nature of me eventually getting a terminal degree. So are they the best indicators of whether or not students are going to be successful or go on to become faculty members who write books about some of the things we're thinking about right now? Not necessarily. So we have to be critical of those numbers when we're only so focused on the numbers. Now, the dominant narrative forgets historical context, and I've sort of sprinkled this in throughout, but there's a lot of evidence that we know that the historical context has led to inequitable access to education for our Latinx students, segregated schooling. Reports coming out of the Civil Rights Project at UCLA show that schools are more segregated now than they were 50 years ago or 60 years ago, right? Almost 60 years ago when Brown v. Board was passed. So if that was the legislation that desegregated schools, we would think that by now we would be at a place where we're completely fully integrated, yet we're not. we're still seeing completely segregated school systems for a whole variety of reasons. Discrimination based on policies about language, test scores, personal hygiene. This has historically been documented. And Latinx students, as a result, end up being on the margins of education throughout their educational systems. And I'll talk about that more in the second presentation. So hopefully you're gonna tune into both, because I will talk more about this historical context and why it continues to be something we have to grapple with. So we have to think about the dominant narrative being sort of forgetting and not really understanding the complexities of the history of our students and how they've gotten to us. Some of the ways in which we've seen this play out at the national level, which is important because the federal government is the one that is actually funding HSIs to do this work, is that the dominant narrative gets played out even further within grant submissions. So this article, if you're gonna look up any article today, I know people tend to take a lot of pictures of my slides, so take the pictures. This one is a really powerful article because it talks about exactly what I'm talking about, that how HSIs continue to value whiteness. And one of the ways that we're seeing this happen is in the grant narrative, that students are sort of framed as the most deficit way we possibly can frame them in order to get federal funding. Now, if I was present live right now with y'all, you have no idea how many people would be shaking their heads like, because I see it all the time. That people are like, yep, that happened at my institution. We did exactly that. We try to show our students are so deficit that we really need this federal funding. And what's the problem with that is that we reinforce the narrative, right? We've got to start challenging that and disrupting that and saying, rather than our students are so deficit and they need this money, our students bring a tremendous amount of cultural capital to campus, and therefore we need some more funding to help elevate it, right? We need to elevate what they're bringing to campus because we're not able to adequately do it with our funding. So let's write that narrative rather than saying, well, they're at high risk and they're poor and they're not ready for college and they're blah, 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 blah. And therefore, please, federal government, give us some money for our HSI program. So we've got to start challenging those of you that are either running HSI grants or are writing those grants. Think about, am I reinforcing that narrative and or how am I disrupting that narrative? Dominant white practices. Nobody has updated this article yet, but I hope somebody does, and maybe it's going to have to be me at some point. But Wade Cole did an analysis of the curriculum at MSIs and basically found that HSIs, the curriculum tends to still be very Eurocentric, right, as opposed to ethnocentric. He uses the term ethnocentric, meaning centered on one ethnic way of knowing. But a majority of the curriculum, what he found was that it actually isn't ethnocentric and that we aren't teaching alternative narratives, or we continue to teach the dominant narrative is a better way to think about it. So we've got to start thinking about how are we disrupting our white practices, particularly in the classroom or in the kind of programs and services that we're providing. So what happens is, this is how HSIs, I lay all these things out in the book to say this is how HSIs have become racialized. Right, that they as a result of the designation being connected to the enrollment of racialized students, that the organizational identity, the HSI identity, also becomes racialized, right? And so indicators of HSI effectiveness based on white normative standards would then lead us to think HSIs aren't that good, right? Or they're not doing that well. Although as we see more and more selective institutions becoming HSIs, AKA the UC system, that narrative is being challenged, even that, yet we have to think, yes, but why, right? Why? Because that larger stratification of the system continues to value the things that would make the UC system, the most elite system, obviously, in the California, among the 3 California systems. Another article written by Nick Vargas, that first article was written by Dr. Nick Vargas, also talks about another article. Me and Nick were like vibing at the same time. Like we always talk about this, like we're basically writing about the same things at the same time about this idea of racializing HSIs and how we still value whiteness. So it subjugates HSIs. And so he wrote this other article and published talking about how the whiter HSIs actually are more likely to get funding. Whiter meaning have a higher percentage of white students. So like an institution that enrolls, let's say 80% Latinx students is less likely to get the federal funding than an institution that enrolls 30% Latinx students and maybe 40% white students. So I think it's really powerful and just sort of reinforce some of these things I had been talking about throughout the book, because it's like, yep, whiteness continues to be valued. Now, as we start to think about HSIs and the diversity of HSIs, this actually data are outdated, and I need to update this because we know that there are now 500 and, I don't know, maybe 58 HSIs. There's a good number, 25 at least, HSIs, yet they're super diverse. And so the diversity makes it really hard for us to have this one big HSI narrative or one HSI identity. And so I often challenge institutions to think about what makes them an effective HSI based on what they are or who they are already. So for example, if you're a rural HSI, which I've spent some time in rural HSIs, how do you be an effective rural HSI? And how is that different than being an effective urban HSI? Because urban HSIs and rural HSIs deal with different things and different students. So you can't just pull on the urban HSIs and what they're doing if you're dealing with different issues as a rural HSI. Community colleges, same thing. Community colleges act very differently, we know, than four-year institutions. And I have in here technical HSI even, because there's those, right, that two-year HSIs that focus primarily on technical education. Like that looks very different than a four-year religious liberal arts HSI. Y'all are just different, like overall. So we can't all just act like each other, despite the fact that that's what tends to happen within higher ed. And so in the book, I talk about the typology of HSI organizational identities, and this is how I frame the book. I frame the book around this typology and thinking about if we only value outcomes, then only a handful of HSIs are actually going to excel or accelerate to what I call Latinx producing, which are those institutions that are doing a good job of graduating students, but maybe they're not actually addressing the culture, the white normative standards, the white curriculum, the white faculty, the ways in which we value white research, those sort of things maybe haven't been disrupted. So just because you're graduating students at high rates doesn't necessarily make you an HSI, right? It makes you what I call in the typology Latinx producing. I actually am working with an institution right now that is Latinx producing, and we are doing an 18-month project, research practice partnership, and they are struggling. I'm laying it out for them on like organizationally or within your culture, here are some things you need to do. I mean, I lay it out in like a 20-page report, and they come back to me and they're like, yeah, here's all these wonderful things we do, Gina, and it's all based on the white normative standards. I'm like, but I thought you were trying to disrupt how you're only Latinx producing, and I'm trying to help for you to disrupt that culture or the organizational structures to help you think more towards moving towards that top quadrant, which is the Latinx serving. And they immediately go back to the white normative standards. It's pretty powerful. Actually, I'm like, yikes, right? Like, I thought you were on board with me. I thought you read my book. I thought, we were going along, we were moving, we're going to disrupt whiteness. Yet when I write this report and give you some feedback on what the cultural elements need to do in order to make you more Latinx enhancing, you push back immediately on and give me all the ways in which you fit the white normative standards, right? So we do that. We fall right back into what we have always known, or that dominant narrative about what is good about institutions of higher ed. So that's basically, if you ever read my book, that's chapter 1. Chapter 1 just lays it out, over and over again. Like, this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about white normative standards. So the chapters, like I said, it's actually written in narrative form. So I get into these stories. And the stories I map onto the typologies and lay out 3 different institutions that are in 3 different types. I have a Latinx producing institution in the sample. I have a Latinx enhancing institution in the sample, and one that was a complete anomaly, but I do call it Latinx serving for a variety of reasons, even though it doesn't actually fit the white normative standards. And that's partially why I put it into the category of Latinx producing, because it's just performing outside of white normative standards in such a powerful way that it is in many ways an HSI. So I lay out these chapters in these critical counter stories. Drawing on all the data, I basically tell stories, right? Like you can read it kind of like a novel, right? Like, okay, there's a narrator and I go through like a story of like, this is what it would feel like to be at a Latinx producing institution, or this is what it would feel like to be at a Latinx enhancing institution. 3 different institutions, all in the Midwest, all in the same city, very, 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 very different institutions, and very different the way they operate in their HSI practices. So ACU is the institution that I call the Latinx enhancing institution. They've been doing stuff around the Latinx identity historically for, since the civil rights movement, really. And a lot of that was pushed by their Puerto Rican students. Actually, they have a pretty large Puerto Rican population at this institution, and their Puerto Rican students were pushing for a lot of this. So they've been doing it for a long time, yet their graduation rates are very, very low, below average. And so they're interesting because they're like, well, we are doing good things, but then we can't seem to get our graduation rates up, right? And in a lot of ways, they're ignoring the historical context of why their students are struggling or why they're struggling to graduate students, which we have to take into consideration. Well, where did these students go to school? They're in Chicago, by the way. Where are they, did they go through the Chicago public school systems? Which schools did they go through? Not to blame, I try to be careful about not blaming public school systems, because I'm a product of a public school system and my children are in public schools and I believe in public schools. Yet we know also the Chicago public school system has a lot of challenges as well. So are all their students coming from there? And if so, how do we address that immediately, right? Rather than saying, oh, they come from the public school system, saying, yay, they come from the public school system. How are we going to get them in and get them ready to get through college? How are we going to take ownership and responsibility for our students? And that's something that they just weren't doing. They were so busy struggling with, we're not a good HSI. And so in many ways, I lay out some of these strengths of how they are Latinx enhancing. Yet they had a lot of challenges, in particular, racial tension. And this comes up a lot. People ask about this a lot. Like, what if your Black population doesn't want you to be an HSI? I'm like, well, that's something you have to grapple with, because you need to, one, effectively serve your Black students as well. If you are a racialized institution, you should be serving all your racialized populations well. And fighting amongst each other is probably not going to help you get to that point in which you are fully liberating all of your students. So that was a big challenge for them. They talked a lot about racial microaggressions and racism continuing to happen, and the lack of representation at the faculty and administrative level. The second institution is the one that I talk about as being, oh no, this is the model. I'm not going to talk about the model much, but I lay out this model of what does a Latinx enhancing institution look like. Second institution is the one that I talk about being a Hispanic serving institution, because they're outdoing the white normative standards in many ways. And so I talk about this in a third space. And this idea that they're bringing in some of the normative standards and sort of pushing back on normative standards, which I call here population measures. And they're valuing student knowledge, particularly language. They're really good about valuing language. And they're reinventing their own script and their own ways in which they value what they're doing that doesn't necessarily match those white normative standards of the population. And so they're really, really, fascinating in that sense. The third institution is very much a Latinx producing institution. And they don't really push back on any of the legitimized outcomes of the institution. And these are some of I talk about these external forces in the chapter that we oftentimes are trying to do what everybody else wants us to do, right? The federal government wants us to do this, and the National Science Foundation, because we have a grant, they want us to do this, and accreditation boards, they want us to do this, and private foundations, because we have a grant, we have to do this, and American Council of Education, they say this. And so we're responding to all these different external pressures, yet the external pressures in the yellow box are pushing for what I call race neutral outcomes, right? They're not necessarily saying you need to perform in ways that are good for your racialized population. And so we need to start thinking, are we pushing back on these race neutral outcomes, and how, right? Because this institution very much was and is graduating students in 4 years. They have great graduation rates, but they're doing it in a race neutral way, meaning that their students never have the opportunity to see themselves in the curriculum, in the classroom, in the programming, in the services offered, none of that. They never get to see that, yet they're an HSI, right? They're an HSI similar to many other HSIs that haven't yet disrupted these white normative ways of operating. I'm going to talk for like maybe 3 more minutes and then allow some questions. In the final chapter, I give recommendations, basically. I say, based on the findings, here are some recommendations. Here's some things I want you to think about. And I throw in the servingness model here. At the time, actually, that I wrote this, I realized that it's actually been published since in the Review of Educational Research, if you want to look it up. The multidimensional model of servingness, I bring in all these different ways of like, here's different outcomes we can think about, but also we need to think about our structures. How do we transform our structures so that we're not only valuing whiteness, so that we are starting to value outcomes that are good for our racialized students, or what I have been recently calling liberatory outcomes, right? What are those outcomes? And as we think about pulling back to what I said in the beginning, as you start to think about how are we going to actually get to racial justice for our Black students, that would be the point at which your students feel liberated, feel empowered, feel like they can determine their own destiny, and that they are liberated in a way that they can say, yes, we're fighting for racial justice on our own, and that we sit back and support them through that. Those liberatory outcomes are really like an important thing for us to think about. I talk about reframing research. That I'm not going to spend much time here. And I'm going to talk about this model in the second talk. Reframing practices, based on the findings, I talk very specifically about some of the practices we need to reframe, particularly curriculum and programs. What kind of programs and what kind of curriculum are we offering if we're an HSI, and does it align with this goal for seeking equity and justice? Or does it continue to value whiteness? Do our programs and services continue to value whiteness? I see in the Alliance for HSI Educators, which I love that organization. I think it's a great organization. Yet they really value high impact practices. Like they love high impact practices. And I'm like, high impact white practices. To quote Z. Nicolazzo and D.L. Stewart, they talk about in an article that's actually about transgender students, about high impact white practices, right? That those practices aren't necessarily good for your students of color, or for your low income students, or for your full-time working students, or for your parenting students, or for whatever, different types of students that you have at an HSI. They're good for traditional white residential students, right? So we can't continue to value the practices that have worked for our white students, because they're not going to work for our students that are not white and or traditional in that sort of sense. Hiring more faculty, staff, and administrators is, of course, at the top of everybody's agenda. Whenever I talk to HSIs, they're like, we've got to do better, we've got to do better. And I have a blog post coming out about this next week. And I will share that on social media. So if you follow me, I'll share it on social media. I talk about in this blog post about anti-racist hiring and how we need to do that in HSIs. And I love writing these blogs because it's exactly what's on my mind right now, right? Like how do we move towards these things right now? Because publications take a lot longer than a blog post can take. Reinforced bilingualism and preservation of language comes from chapter 4. Providing high-touch practices is important, yet we've got to do them in culturally relevant ways. Providing diverse financial aid packages is a really powerful one that comes out of the third institution. And stop using race-neutral lens. And this, again, as we think about racial justice for our students, if we're not talking about race every single day, we're not actually committed to Black Lives Matter, and we're not committed to racial justice. We have to constantly be naming it. 100% race has got to be at the forefront. Now I'm going to talk about that one. I also talk about reframing policy. The goal of the book, when I wrote the book, really was to get it in the hands of legislators. That until the federal government responds to some of these things, we're going to continue to value the white normative standards because the federal government does. Right? So we've got to push back. So if there's anybody in the audience who has access to the federal government, the legislation, and is writing policy at the national level or at the state level, y'all are the people who am writing for. Yes, practitioners use the book in many ways, but the reality is until those large external forces change, we're going to continue to value whiteness, right? Particularly in policies. So there we go. At this point, I'll pretend like y'all are clapping for me. Yay, okay, I'm done. I'll go ahead and I think Lori is going to guide us through, I guess, maybe 10 to 15 minutes of question and answer.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, you can't hear all the clapping, but certainly thank you for introducing all these great ideas and very provocative things for us to think about. So some of the questions that are coming in, I'm going to start with one about the changing demographics in the U.S. where Latinx students are often primarily in southern states. And so some of the northern states are developing kind of southern strategies to attract and recruit these Latinx students. And this participant wants to know, in this way, becoming or aiming to become an HSI can actually become a tool for racially white institutions to survive. Could you comment on that?
Yes. Let me real quick. I want to read it. I'm not sure I'm fully understanding the South. Like South as in
coming from Texas, California, Florida. Yeah.
Okay. The Southwest primarily.
Southwest.
When I think about the South, actually,
I know.
So there's actually a growing Latinx population in the South, the U.S. South, the Southern U.S. So North Carolina, Georgia, those sort of traditionally Southern, very Black-white states are actually seeing a huge influx of Latinx populations. And the HSI population hasn't caught up yet, but it will, because the HSI population takes a little bit of time. So as far as changing out, let me read it real quick again. So I'm going to challenge this and say, I mean, this idea of Southern strategies is interesting to me. I'm going to actually challenge it and say, and put it back into racial terms, right? Because I've been talking about, like, we've got to center race. We're talking about racialized institutions. So I'm going to talk about it in racial terms, because I think that more than these like Southern strategies, we're actually seeing very regional sort of strategies, but also racial ethnic strategies. So when I think about HSIs and even my own research and where we sort of framed HSIs in research, it's often centered on, yes, Texas and California ways of knowing. And Texas and California traditionally have been predominantly Mexican-American or Mexican or Chicano, predominantly. Obviously, there's lots of other populations in Texas and California, other Latinx populations, but it's a very different Latinx population than we would see maybe in the Northeast, right? If the research had all been coming out of the Northeast, let's say New York, which New York has had HSIs for before 1992, the designation even came about, we would have seen a different narrative, right? Because there's different types of Latinx folks in the Northeast, right? Again, we're all everywhere. Latinx people are everywhere, but we see a larger population oftentimes of Caribbean, right? And or Afro-Latinx people. Right. So the narrative, if we were really coming out from that place, might have been a little bit more on that, but it's not. It is. You're right. It's coming out of the Southwest, Northern, and Texas. So people are framing right around those ideas. But I'm going to push back even more and say, I don't think they're framing around those things. I don't think people are even centering Latinx ways of knowing and being. They're continuing to center, as I noted, white things. For example, people oftentimes put white, the high impact practices. Y'all know those, right? We teach these in higher ed. High impact practices. What is a common high impact practice? Study abroad, internships, research with faculty. Those are some of the common ones, right? All of those things, like I said, if we say are high impact white practices, if you put those into your grant, which people do, guess who you're going to attract? You're going to attract those traditional students who are probably not as many, probably not working, probably full-time students who can dedicate their time and energy to that, because we're not thinking outside the box about what those high impact practices, who they attract, and how they need to look different for your population who might be working full-time, might be managing multiple family obligations, might be living in a mixed status family, right? When it comes or undocumented themselves, and maybe limited in some of those in their ability to participate in some of those high impact practices, like studying abroad, right? So we have to challenge that, I think, more than maybe this southwestern narrative or the southern narrative, but the white narrative, right? Are we actually valuing those things that are traditionally white students have been shown to do very well in? But that's because everything has been based on, early on. We definitely have more research coming out with and for people of color, but we still draw on those Aston high impact practices or what's that, Tinto, right? Tinto practices, when we know that we have to think differently and outside the box of those.
Okay, thank you so much. So you referenced how grants are often written in a deficit-oriented way, and I thought that was an excellent insight as we often are preparing those grants. But as one of our students noted, a lot of times staff who might have particular knowledge about students to offer are not involved in the grant writing process. Mm-hmm. And so the question was, what recommendations might you give for staff who want to be more involved in that and to speak into that process so it is not so deficit-based?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a great comment. And also, I would say arguably, one of the big things I hear from ethnic studies faculty is that they aren't involved in the grant writing. Mm-hmm. That is like very, very common, right? That ethnic studies faculty and Chicana studies faculty, and Mexican American studies faculty, like those faculty are like, yeah, we've been doing this since like the 1960s, and we know how to do it really well. And our pedagogy is humanizing, and it's culturally relevant, and it's liberatory, and we write about those things, yet we're not the ones who are writing the grants and or asked to be a part of those teams, right? So I would agree, staff who have the knowledge, who are on the ground doing that work are often not necessarily brought to the table, but also your faculty who have that knowledge, right? So as you put together these grant teams, that's what you want to think about, right? Is like, okay, who should be a part of this team? Who has that knowledge, and also who does it well, right? Because we know there are good practices on our campus. So rather than reinforcing and putting in, again, those white normative practices into our grant, think, okay, who's been doing this for a long time? Okay, ethnic studies. Y'all are in California. Y'all are ahead of the game. I talk to institutions that don't have ethnic studies programs. Y'all in California, there's ethnic studies program all across the state, and it's becoming policy, right? We know that's happening right in front of our eyes, which is amazing. That policy, at a policy level, students are going to be getting ethnic studies at multiple points in their educational career, which is amazing. But those folks have been doing this for a long time. How do we tap into them and bring them into those teams? I have an article written about EOP program, and how EOP has been serving students really well for so long, 50, 60 years, yet EOP still continues to be oftentimes at the margins, right? Mm-hmm. And again, this is that point, whereas if I was live with y'all, those of you who have worked in TRIO, EOP, Gear Up, those types of programs are like, and y'all are usually sitting together and y'all are, yep, we see you, Gina, because those programs continue to be on the margins, right? We're not bringing them to the center because we're centering things like, and I'm always going to throw shade at guided pathways. Guided pathways is also white normative knowledge. If you want, like, if you look up the source of guided pathways and where it came from NYU, written by a bunch of what I call old white dudes who, yeah, they ran all the data and said, you know, community colleges aren't doing well and they're not graduating students at high rates. And here's a way in which we're going to propose that we can address this, yet their proposed guided pathways model was 100% race neutral. No race in any of it. And I've been part of a couple different consortiums to think about how do we bring race into guided pathways. And I think people who are implementing guided pathways are being intentional, but the founders, the original creators, created that in a very race neutral way. Meaning students of color were not at the center of those practices, right? So we've got to challenge 100% at every step of the way, are we actually centering the students of color and the minoritized students, low-income students, first-gen students that we are seeking to serve?
Right. And I think highlighting the issue of position of power and often how long it takes to recruit faculty and staff. So as you think about navigating whiteness when the majority of professors perhaps are white and continue to perpetuate the white narrative, and if you're not in a position of power and want to not have to wait to replace all of those faculty, what are some actions that you would recommend that would disrupt that narrative still in a white dominant system?
Right. Yeah, that's a huge one. That's definitely, like I said, that one, people are grappling with that one over and over again. It's like, how do we change the composition of our faculty and staff? And we have to understand there's bigger forces. Like, for one, faculty don't go away very quickly, particularly when if you're in a tenure system and they have tenure. They might stay for 30, 40 years and they're still pulling on ideas from like 1980s, right? We're like, those are really outdated ideas. We've got to get you up on board, right? So we know those sort of forces are happening. Yet, what we also see is that when lines do open, faculty lines or staff lines, that sometimes we still don't bring in people that are either people of color and or committed to equity and justice, right? So again, we've got to put it at the center. In the blog post that I wrote recently, I talked about a couple different techniques, right, for as you're starting to think about hiring. One that is I think people are starting to think about how do they do it and maybe considering it is the cluster hiring, right? That you could hire a cluster of faculty. University of Arizona, from what I understand, is going to be maybe the first to do an HSI cluster hire. And I know they're vice provost for HSI initiatives over there. And so we've talked about this, right? That like, what if you hired for HSI, right? That people have got to be committed to being at an HSI, to serving the students that are in HSI. And that has to come through in every part of their the recruiting process from the letter, it's got to be in the call, first of all, right? The call to even submit your applications. But everything they submit there's got to be a narrative around how are you going to contribute, right, to this HSI thing. So you can do cluster hirings around topics, and it could be HSI if you're an HSI. University of Arizona actually had a successful cluster hire for transgender studies, for folks who do work with and for transgender community. And they hired 4 folks across the institution, across disciplines, who were committed. And I believe all of them themselves identified as transgender or gender nonconforming. So they know it works, right? There's some success. APLU wrote a report about that I recently cited. So you can look this up to find some evidence of it, but cluster hiring is one way. But making sure that race and what I'm saying, also equity and justice are in the conversation, right? That when you are talking about recruiting, you're talking about being very intentional about that. Now, the interesting thing about California is y'all have a system that is basically designed to, your UC system is designed to have faculty and staff come right from that system that go in and work in the other systems. And that system is quite diverse. right? So if you aren't hiring diverse folks from that system, and those folks want to stay in California, we know California people want to stay in California, then there's something going on that you are valuing whiteness, right? How are you valuing whiteness in your rubric, in the way you're reviewing your CVs or your resumes that are coming through? Like, you've got to disrupt that, and you've got to put it into the rubric and into the evaluation system and into the interview questions, into every part of the process. So yeah, that's, like I said, this is actually something that's on my mind a lot right now. So I could talk about it for a long time, but I'll stop there.
Okay, all right. Well, continuing thinking about those disruptive conversations, how would you speak into an effort to transform the curriculum, knowing how vital that is?
Yeah.
What are some strategies that you think could be effective to making a more anti-racist curriculum?
Yeah, again, it's something that's on top of people's minds. So the institution I'm working with, that I talked about how they are so committed to doing this work and disrupting their organizational structures that are committed to whiteness, but then yet they continue to value whiteness. They're doing some interesting things. One thing that they are working on is what they're calling learning communities, right? Faculty coming together, and they are using their HSI grant money to actually incentivize faculty. And I talk about this in the Decolonizing HSI model, that you have to incentivize folks sometimes to get them to do this work. And so they are incentivizing faculty to work together in teams to restructure the curriculum. And so interestingly, they had a couple departments, like full departments, that said, we're gonna do it as a department. And then they had some just staff or faculty who said, we're gonna do it individually. And I think me and my contact over there, we are in agreement that the departmental projects are probably going to be more powerful, because the whole department has got to be on board, right? Like, you've got to rethink it. And we do this in my department here at Pitt, as we think about our higher education program. All of the faculty, we had a meeting, I want to say 2 weeks ago, to talk about how are we bringing in more racial justice. We already do that, a lot of that work, but how do we bring more in? What books are we reading? What books are going to be in each of the core classes? Are they the most up-to-date books? Are we on top of it? And so we do have the conversation as a program, because I think it is more powerful when it's at the program level to do that work. So yeah, there's a lot of conversation about that, but it is time consuming. And if you have the ability to incentivize faculty, do that, right? And definitely find ways to say, hey, even if it's like a course buyout, restructuring your entire curriculum actually is worthy of a course buyout. It takes that much time and that much energy, right? So we've got to allow faculty to do this work. We got to give them some incentive and some time to do that work.
Good, thank you. So our last question before we take a break here is following up on the high impact practices a bit, and to say, is there research that you're aware of, or could you speak a little bit to what might these high impact practices look like if they were designed for students of color?
Yeah, so I just wrote about this also in my blog post. I talk about liberatory outcomes, and the reality is liberatory outcomes, when I write about them and when I think about them, they're outcomes that we value in higher ed anyways. So one, for example, is civic engagement, right? Civic engagement is such an important outcome in higher ed that there is a classification in the Carnegie classification if you are a civically engaged campus, right? It's that valued at in higher ed. Now, what I would challenge you then to think about, what does civic engagement look like for maybe students who work part-time and go to school part-time, students who are low income and maybe have to work or take care of families, students, undocumented students, right? Those kind of students who have other reasons why maybe civic engagement isn't their most top priority, right? How do you rethink that? Because civic engagement in higher ed has been defined in what I call white normative ways. Did you vote? Did you volunteer in a political office? And did you volunteer at like a church or a soup kitchen, right? White normative ways, right? Traditional, old school normative ways of volunteering, rather than rethinking, well, how do our students of color, first generation students, low income students, how do they engage civically, right? And if we think about the Black Lives Matter movement right now, who are our students that are leading the movement? right? Are they leading the movement? Because our students likely are, right? They're the ones that are out there organizing the protests, telling students where to meet, people where to meet, getting folks out, getting the permits or whatever it needs to do. That's their civic engagement, but it's not captured in our white normative measures of what civic engagement is. Did you lead a Black Lives Matter protest? Cool, you are civically engaged. And guess what? That's a liberatory way in which you could be civically engaged, right? Voting, great, sounds great. Guess what? Your undocumented students can't vote. Therefore, we would classify them as being unengaged, right? If we measured them only in that way. So how do your undocumented students get engaged? In a whole bunch of ways that isn't just voting, right? They might be the ones that are leading those movements, right? They might be the ones organizing and bringing folks together and taking folks up to the Capitol to push for legislation for AB 540 students, right? That's civic engagement, yet we captured civic engagement in our white normative way by saying, if you vote, you're civically engaged. Yeah, that's not going to happen with your population. So we've got to rethink, how are we even measuring these outcomes that we do value, we've always valued. We just have to rethink what they look like for our student population.
Great, thank you so much. We want to give you and our participants a little bit of a break, as we'll come back at 11 Pacific time. I'm going to leave this site open, so you can just kind of keep on mute, and we should be okay. And we'll be back at 11 Pacific time for the second session to push us a little more toward equity and justice.
So for the second session, what I wanted to do was talk a little bit more. So some of the questions y'all had were about, I was reading through the chats, really get into like, well, how? And that's what I get a lot of. I get a lot of how. I do a lot of consulting work. Well, I used to do a lot of consulting work. Now it's all Zoom. But whenever I go into an institution, there is a lot of questioning around, how do we do this? So I am going to present to y'all an organizational model. And the organizational model tends to be a little bit more tangible for people, despite the fact that the organizational model is actually called Decolonizing HSIs. It's based on this idea of decolonizing education. And I'll talk a little bit about that and what that means. But the model is actually more practical. It is a tangible way for you to think about the organization as a whole. I'm an organizational theorist, and so for me, the organization has got to be the approach. Everything I've written about has basically been about how do we address servingness, what I now call servingness, at the organizational level. We can't put it on students. We can't recruit different students so that they can change our outcome numbers or whatever we're going to use as an indicator of servingness without us first addressing what we're doing, right, organizationally. So the model gives people something to work with. So hopefully it'll help y'all think about some of these questions. And I'll give you a little hint. I'm actually writing a full book about the model currently. And I don't think I can write it fast enough because I think people really vibe with the model because it is an organizational model. So basically what I'm doing is taking the model and taking it to book form to give people more tangible ideas for something that seems to work for people to really understand how do we do this organizationally. So before we do any of this, I do want to make sure we recognize land. I think we should start to recognize land more, but also we need to go beyond recognizing land. And there's lots of ways that we can do this. And institutions are starting to develop their recognition of land, their organizational recognitions of land, but it's not enough, right? We need to be thinking the fact that we are visitors on the land, unless you're native to the area. And what does that mean for Indigenous communities we serve, and also our students and their connection, bigger picture, and particularly at an HSI, is their connection to settler colonialism and settler colonialism, without going into a whole conversation about settler colonialism or a whole lecture about that, there are typically three entities that come into it. The triad of settler colonialism: settlers, people who came and settled our, what we now consider US territory, and the enslaved people that they brought with them are usually part of this process, and then the indigenous people that they basically uprooted and sent to very, very small parts, little small parts of the country, which are now basically reservations, despite the fact that all the land was the original caretakers of the land had all of the land. So those three things make for a very complicated conversation about how do we decolonize education, and I think it's an important way to bring in the conversation about Black Lives Matter or racial justice, because like I said, the triad of settler colonialism includes enslaved people, right? That formerly enslaved people were brought here as part of the settler colonial mission. All right, so there's a lot of ways in which we can use this idea of decolonization and not use it metaphorically, but really think, what if we did really get back to our roots? You really think like the land, who are the original caretakers of the land, who was brought here, forced here, and how does that affect their outcomes? Right? Actually, Black students, pretty much on every campus I ever visit, have the lowest outcomes. And it's never surprising to me, because I'm like, yes, racism. Yes, we're talking about people who are connected to the transatlantic slave trade, many of them who were brought here, other than, you know, people who identify as Black immigrants. If they're African American, they're connected to that settler colonialism. So it's a really complicated thing. And so the recognition of land, I think, is just one step as we start to think about moving towards actually decolonizing our institutions, if that's what you actually are going for. And so I frame this argument around decolonizing education, and educational scholars are really thinking about what does that mean to decolonize education, and not, you know, in a metaphorical way, but actually rethink everything we're delivering, everything we are doing within the classroom. This conversation, I've also have been talking about equity and justice and liberation for quite some time, and I feel like people are finally now on board. Like the last few months, as we've seen the racial uprisings in the country, people are starting to say racial justice, equity and justice versus diversity and inclusion. I've been pushing back against diversity and inclusion for quite some time, and I'm going to give you a little overview of what I think our progress to getting to equity and justice and where we're at now. In higher education, if we think about the civil rights movement and how people of color really started to push for changing structures, right? Structures have not changed because the people who are in power, the people with the most privilege, or the people who have access to benefiting the most from the structures wanted to change them. They typically change because people who are the subjugated or the oppressed say, hey, guess what? We're not being adequately served by these structures. And that's exactly what we saw at an important historical point in US higher education around the civil rights movement, is that students, college students, pushed back, right? People of color, college students of color were saying, hey, we're not adequately being served. There's no faculty that look like us. There's no curriculum for us. There's no programs for us. And we saw the evolution of ethnic studies, some more people of color being hired for faculty administrator positions, you know, the evolution or the development of programs, like I mentioned earlier, like EOP, TRIO type programs, that are all coming up around this time. So at that time, multiculturalism on campus starts to be the thing, right? They were like, okay, we are now embracing or bringing in more folks of color, more diverse folks, and we should celebrate that, right? Like it becomes a celebration. Which eventually we start to push back and say diversity isn't about celebrating food, fun, and festivities. That can't be what diversity is about, right? So multiculturalism was an important way for us to say, yeah, let's recognize multiple ways that people are showing up on campus, but it eventually wasn't enough, right? That multiculturalism and celebration of difference isn't good enough. So we move into this idea of diversity, and diversity starts to really come into play because there isn't compositional diversity in the early 1990s particularly in the much more selective institutions, there's not a lot of diversity. This is where we really start to see diversity start to come up, racial diversity and diversity of different social identities. So diversity is what we're pushing for. It's also connected to this narrative around affirmative action, right? That affirmative action is being challenged around this time. And so folks who are writing about diversity at the time, folks who you said have been the people who have given this lecture, like Dr. Mitch Chang, who both me and Dr. Newman worked with at UCLA, really are writing the narrative. The way I say I wrote my book for legislators, yeah, Dr. Chang is writing for the Supreme Court, right? To say that diversity is absolutely 100% necessary in colleges and universities, and we can't disrupt affirmative action. That we need diversity because everybody benefits from diversity. Everybody, but mostly white people, right? Because if we have people of color on campus, then they can teach everybody else, the white people, the dominant population, but it's framed around how everybody benefits, right? So diversity becomes the thing. We start to see a shift, I would say, in the last 10 years or so. And particularly as I think about my own work and why I really started to think that diversity wasn't good enough was because I'm working with institutions that are compositionally diverse, right? So if you were at a Hispanic-serving institution, diversity, you can check the box, right? Yep, we check the diversity box. We have compositional diversity at the undergraduate level. Is it anywhere else? No, it's not. The rest of the institution is still super not diverse and still very monolithic and still very white. But at the undergraduate level, we now have diversity. So diversity for me is no longer can't be the conversation. Inclusion also is problematic because inclusion doesn't actually critically push back on exclusion or who doesn't show up. So when we say, oh yeah, we're super inclusive, these spaces are so inclusive, yet people don't show up, yeah, that's because in some way they're exclusive, right? So the conversation really shouldn't be about how are we being inclusive, but how are we actually being exclusive? Who doesn't show up? Who doesn't participate? Who doesn't take the courses? Who doesn't participate in high impact practices? Who doesn't do these things? The exclusion conversation makes it a little bit more critical, right? And so for me, diversity inclusion is like, okay, we've got to stop doing that, particularly at a HSI, where I'm starting to really push for this idea of social justice and equity and liberation at an organizational level. So social justice, of course, is a process where we start to really frame it around oppressed and dominant groups, right? That we have to understand the dominant narrative, which going back to the first presentation is that white normative narrative, in order to liberate or work for the liberation of oppressed groups. We have to disrupt the dominant practices. And it is a process and it does take time. There's lots of definitions of this, by the way. There's plenty of good working definitions of social justice. But for one, it does have to be around this conversation of oppression and who is oppressed, and then work towards disrupting the ways in which those who are oppressed haven't had access to equitable resources. You know, on here on the slide, it says safety and security, self-determination, independent agency. Who hasn't had access to all of those, right? Or the current conversation around Black Lives Matter and racial justice for Black folks is, you know, the fact that Black people are killed in much higher rates by police officers. Yes, do police officers kill white people? Sure. They just happen to kill Black people at much higher rates, right? That means their safety is at risk, right? If you are a Black man in America and you have to worry about whether or not you might be shot by the police every time you walk out of your door, or your family has to worry that you lack the safety and security, both physically, psychologically, socially, that this country owes you, right? And so until everybody feels 100% safe walking out into society, and we all feel like we are being adequately served, which right now there's a lot of conversation about health inequities, and that Black and Latinx and people of color are being disproportionately affected, and Native populations, by the way, by COVID-19, that until those inequities no longer exist, we don't have justice. right? As long as those inequities exist, there's not justice, right? So we've got to think about the practices and the procedures and the ways in which we address those inequities. Social justice, also, I teach a course on social justice, also is where the history, right, where I talk about history, I draw on history. History is so important. We've got to think about historically, how did this come to be? Which is how I talk about the settler colonialism, and that is historic. We've got to think critically about how did we get here? How did we get to this moment in 2020 to see such inequities? And it didn't just happen overnight. It happened over 400 years, some would say, 600 years, some would say, since BC, right? Like we could name many points at which this has all sort of become solidified, right? The inequities have become solidified. But the reality is it's historical, and we've got to address that and recognize that before we can disrupt that. So equity and justice and liberation, for me, it really falls within a pedagogy of the oppressed sort of way of thinking, Freirean way of thinking. This is where I always seem to come back to Freire around what is justice, what is liberation. And those of us that are in education, if you've never read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, consider it your assignment now, right? I would hope that y'all have been exposed to it, but the reality is this is a book that's been banned, right? There's places that have banned Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Tucson Unified School District, when they were pushing back on ethnic studies in high school, even despite the fact that they were showing that that program was actually working and that students were going to college at much higher rates and going on and being successful in much higher rates than they were before they were in ethnic studies. That was one of those books that was banned, right? Pedagogy of the Oppressed banned, because it makes us think, I guess, outside the box or more critical. But Pedagogy of the Oppressed is such a powerful way to conceptualize this idea of liberation, and particularly around oppressor and oppressed working together. Although the oppressed in the Freirean sort of perspective are doing the liberation, right? And so it can't be from like an ally perspective or from an altruistic perspective, whereas like people from dominant groups say, oh, we're gonna give you, whatever it may be, or we're gonna help, support you maybe, but we can't provide this, right? We can't liberate you. The oppressed should liberate themselves, although the oppressor has to allow that to happen and has to empower the oppressed to do that. So I think it's an important way to think about it. And when I connect it back to HSIs, I think about going back to the question about so many white people in faculty and administration and governing boards, by the way. That's where my current research in HSIs is at, is your governing boards tend to be pretty white also, even at HSIs. That those folks who have the power, that they have to think about it from this liberation perspective. That like, yes, from a racial, social justice perspective, people with whiteness, people who are white, are considered the oppressor, are the ones with the most privilege, that they've got to work side by side, right? That if we're not going to be able to completely transform the faculty and staff and administration immediately, that those white people have got to be on board with liberation, right? So until your white people are on board with liberation, you're not fully at that point in which you're actually an HSI. And so we're working towards praxis. So when I think about a decolonized HSI, this is the outcome. It's no longer about, graduation rates, but it's actually about liberation. What if we really started to think outside the box and say, that's our goal, is that we work towards equity and justice and liberation for our students. And yeah, graduation is one equitable outcome, but there's all these other ways in which we can think about how we have to provide equitable experiences for all of our students. I always bring in an equity-minded perspective when I'm talking about these sort of things, drawing largely on Dr. Estella Bensimon's work, because it's such a powerful way to think about it, to think about equity, because equity is one of those words that is starting to be overutilized, and then we kind of stop thinking about, we don't even know what it is. And so I like this definition that they provide about equity-mindedness being about addressing inequitable outcomes, recognizing equitable outcomes, disaggregating data so you can understand the equitable outcomes, and then actually taking action to disrupt the structures. And they are really good about talking about not using deficit language to talk about students, which is what I was talking about in the last presentation, right? It's like we can't think about our students as deficit because that's not a liberated HSI, right? That's not a decolonized HSI, or that point at which we feel like we're fully being a serving institution. So I think it's a good framework and a good way to sort of sum up this idea of equity and justice and liberation, and how do we work towards it. So why decolonize HSI? So let's start thinking about what does it mean to decolonize, and why do we have to do it? Just a little snippets of some things to think about. For one, education. Those folks, educational researchers who are talking about this idea of decolonizing education, recognize that education is a colonial project. That education was one of the ways in which settlers delivered their message, right? Or helped to disrupt Indigenous ways of knowing, and instead enforce and require that Indigenous folks and the original people of the land start thinking in their ways, or in the quote unquote civilized way, right? Which we know settler colonialism comes from Europe. So the European, right? The European way. And so education was one of those ways. It's always been one of those ways, right? Religion is another one. Religion is a powerful way that settler colonialism has played out in the United States and how we got to where we're at. But education is one. So we have to think, if education is a tool for colonialism or a colonial project, then that's a reason why we need to think about disrupting it, right? To rethink education. And has education always been with the purpose of educating people to understand the dominant way of knowing, right? That's another way to think about it. Or going back to white normative practices, that if we're delivering a curriculum that reinforces dominant white ways of knowing, what we're saying is our students, they don't bring knowledge, they don't bring anything to the classroom, and they need to know the dominant way of knowing, or they're not going to survive, right? And people will say that, people will tell me that, but like in my field, you have to know these dominant ways of thinking. And I'm like, why? What if you challenge those ways? And what if your students got to learn how to challenge those ways of thinking? And what if we started thinking about, well, you student who comes to the classroom with a tremendous amount of your own knowledge from your home, from your family, from your ancestors, maybe you have some input on the same topic, right? Why is it only the dominant narrative that our students get to learn versus them bringing their narrative here? So education, always been a colonial project. Curriculum, I love Cathy de los Rios writes about the curriculum being a tool for colonization, and that it's always been used to quote unquote Americanize or acculturate Indigenous people and or Latinx people. Latinx people are also connected to this idea of settler colonialism, and it gets really complicated because when we think about Indigenous people to the United States, we think about Native American folks. Yet your Latin American or your Latinx students who are of Caribbean descent, settler colonialism went right through the Caribbean actually before it ever got to modern day US. Christopher Columbus, he landed in the Caribbean, not in present day United States. So settler colonialism hits the Caribbean real hard. So your Latinx populations and also your other Caribbean populations are products of settler colonialism, right? And they too have been connected to this idea that that the curriculum or education have been a way to Americanize them, right? Same with all the way through Latin America, right? Settlers went all the way through, and Spanish settlers in particular went all the way through Latin America, right? And did the same exact process of quote unquote enculturating the Indigenous people of Latin America. Oops, I'm back. It gets a little finicky sometimes. Higher education as a colonial project. Another assignment for you, I'm giving a lot of assignments. It's summer, so maybe you have some time, I don't know. But if you have never accessed Ebony and Ivy, Craig Wilder's Ebony and Ivy, it is like such an important way to understand higher education as a colonial project, because Craig Wilder lays out how the most elite institutions in this country, the Ivies over in the Northeast, how they were basically founded on the backs of enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, and your native populations of the area. So if we want to think about higher ed and like, well, how is higher ed a colonial project? It absolutely is. And if we all are basing our educational systems on those institutions, which are the original institutions of the country, Harvard, the first institution of higher ed in the country. And if we're trying to model what's going on in those, we have to remember that those institutions were colonial projects. They are colonial projects. So we've got to be critical about us as institutions of higher ed as well. Post-colonial education for what I call raza in the article, for a variety of reasons, which I briefly mentioned in the article. But basically it leads to this idea, which you all saw this slide in the last one, that like, why are we segregated? Why is there inequitable outcomes? Why is there discrimination based on who people are and how they show up to the classroom? Why? Because of settler colonialism. Because we're constantly trying to use education to get people to become acculturated or to become part of the dominant, right? We don't value, generally in education, the way students show up, despite the fact that our students show up with a tremendous amount of knowledge. This leads to, of course, inequitable outcomes for our students, which we see Latinx students concentrated in community colleges. They've got low transfer rates, inequitable four-year graduation rates, unwelcoming environment, racial microaggressions. Do you belong here? Where are you from? You speak English very well. All of those things are happening to your students, right, on a regular basis if you're serving Latinx students at an HSI. And that's connected to this long-term history of not really valuing the way our students show up. So HSIs, already talked about these, so I'm not gonna talk too much about it, but we know 25% Latinx enrollment, 50% low income means you're eligible HSI. Doesn't mean you are an HSI, you still gotta go through the process. I exposed y'all to the typology in the last presentation, so I'm not gonna talk much about it, but with this presentation, what I bring in is this idea that when we only value the white normative things or these student outcomes, that we actually, that's a deficit-minded approach, right? That when our students don't graduate in 4 years, or they don't graduate in 6 years, or they don't graduate in then whatever we decide is the best amount of time for them to graduate, that we often blame them, right? And we start to think, well, what's wrong with them? Well, what are they doing? Well, do they show up? Do they access the support services? Do they do this? Do they do that? Do they? And we blame the students versus this access on the bottom, the culture axis. I call it like the X and Y axis. The culture axis is much more equity minded. So equity minded is where you actually take responsibility as an institution and say, we have got to think about how to better serve our students. Something is wrong with us. Every time you open your mouth and say, well, what's wrong with the students? Close it and ask what's wrong with us. So why aren't our students passing entry-level math? Well, why are we not teaching it right? Why are we not teaching in the way that they can get through it, right? Why aren't our students showing up to class, or I don't know, whatever it may be? Why aren't students reading? I had an institution tell me, I asked them to give me deficit narratives about their students. They said, oh, our students never read, they don't read. I'm like, okay, well, maybe you should put it back on you and say, how do students who are 18 years old get information these days? They get it in a lot of other ways besides a book, right? So maybe we have got to rethink, how are we delivering the curriculum, right? Maybe they like podcasts. Maybe we could drop a couple podcasts in. Maybe they, learn through social media. Maybe we could drop some social media engagement learning with them. Maybe they, we have them watch videos, right? Like reading a book and opening it up, yes, super important, but also super colonial, right? Like that can't be the only way. Although if we think about early higher ed, it actually wasn't even books. It was the most, well-informed people narrating to students. So can we think outside the box, and can we deliver information differently rather than blaming the students, right? How can we address our organizational structures to be better for liberating students and to working towards equitable outcomes? So that's, a good sort of overview of why, yet there's so many books and so many articles that have been written about education as a colonial project. So if you really want to start thinking about this, look into some of those resources. Decolonizing HSI. So the framework is, when I first wrote it and first published it, and the citations at top had 9 organizational elements. These are the elements of the institution that we as faculty and staff and administrators and board trustees and even beyond that, accreditation folks and all the different people who have some sort of say in the education of our students, these are things we can address. In the new model, I'm giving you all my secrets, in the new model, there's 10 dimensions. So I added a dimension and I merged some of these dimensions and I complicated some of these dimensions. But there was 9 dimensions in the original model. So the original model, I start with mission. And I really think about how are we embracing our HSI mission to begin with. Now, the reality is there's research that shows that HSIs don't embrace their HSI designation in their mission. Now, mission, the research will tell us, organizational research, that mission, whatever's in your mission, that's what you're about. So if it's not in your mission, you're probably not actually that committed to it. So do you have to say you're an HSI in your mission? You don't have to. The federal government doesn't say you have to, but you should probably start to think about if you should. If you're getting federal dollars from the government to be an HSI, then you're an HSI. And it's a federal designation the same way land grant institutions are federal designations. So land grants don't seem to have a problem putting that they're land grants in their mission. And I would ask at this moment, if we were together, anybody go to a land grant? People raise their hand. Did you know you were at a land grant? People are like, yes, I knew I was at a land grant. It's very common knowledge when you're at a land grant institution that you're at it. So why don't we value it in the same way for HSI? It's just a federal designation that allows you to get federal funding. That's it. Until you put meaning to it, that's all the HSI designation is. So should you put it in? Sure. You're getting federal dollars. You should absolutely start to think about whether or not it's there. Now the meaning you attach to it is where the rest of the elements come into play. But saying you're an HSI is not a bad thing unless you are committed to whiteness and you're thinking that if you say you're an HSI, it means that you are lesser than, right? If you believe that, then I could see why you might actually, struggle a little bit with HSI. Do you think it means that other people aren't included? Maybe, but that's where you have to have a critical conversation about HSI being inclusive rather than exclusive, right? What does that mean? Who are we excluding with the HSI designation, and how do we push back on that and be more inclusive? I also talk about your mission having words like empowerment and liberation and justice rather than diversity and inclusion. I've already went through why diversity and inclusion is no longer where we're at in higher ed, that it's got to be about empowerment, liberation, equity, justice for all. I also talk about anti-racism and anti-oppression. And I was saying this, I've been saying this for several years, that we should say we're anti-racist, but now people agree with me. I'm like, yes. So let's see how many institutions actually address their mission and say, we are an anti-racist institution. All right, how many are going to go beyond the statement that their president sent 2 months ago and actually address their mission? Because if you're not, you're probably not actually committed to it. You were just writing a statement because everybody else was. That's what we do. We tend to do what everybody else is doing. So until it's in our mission, until we're actually working towards being anti-racist, we're probably continuing to be racist. Purpose. The purpose is where we start to shift this idea of what the actual outcomes in an institution of higher ed should be. So that goes back to like not just valuing the white normative outcomes and start valuing, I guess, non-traditional outcomes or things that would lead to liberation and justice for our students. So I lay out some of them and I call them non-normative. Academic outcomes, you're always going to have to care about your academic outcomes. You're an institution of higher ed. You're always going to have to care about that. So I'm never going to say don't care about those things, although they need to be in equity terms, right? That they should be disaggregated. But also your non-academic outcomes. Critical consciousness, if I get to decide what HSI should value, critical consciousness development is one of those liberatory outcomes that we should be valuing. Now we're seeing, y'all being in California, we're seeing in many ways that California agrees, right? And maybe they read my work, I don't know. But I think a lot of people in California already knew this, that ethnic studies is a place where people actually get critical consciousness development. So it should be something that everybody gets exposed to, not a diversity requirement, an ethnic studies requirement. Those are very different things. Diversity, not necessarily pushing for critical consciousness. Ethnic studies is, right? So critical consciousness development is a really excellent outcome that HSI should be committed to. Racial identity development, we should allow students to grapple with their own race. I will guarantee you there are students that show up at an HSI who don't want to be whatever they are because society has told them it's bad to be whatever they are. It's bad to be Latinx. It's bad to be undocumented. It's bad to be queer. It's bad to be whatever, transgender. It's bad to be whatever it is because society tells us. And so college is such an important point. And I think you would all agree with this because this is something higher ed we've been saying, particularly our student affairs, those of us that come from a student affairs background, that students should have the opportunity to explore their identities in a powerful way, in an empowering way. So for me, I just say, yeah, let's do that. And HSI should be committed to doing those things, right? We should make sure they have those opportunities to explore who they are as racialized and or minoritized beings. And how are we doing that? Is it in the classroom? Is it out of the classroom? How many ways are we doing that? Activism right now is like all the rage, right? Again, I've been talking about this for quite some time, but I'm like, yes, activism is finally like really, getting value, that we see activism actually leads to change. So how are we encouraging our students to be active, right? Beyond just civic engagement, like actually activism for change, for racial justice. Democratic participation, academic self-concept, social self-concept. These are all concepts that we have seen that HSIs are good at producing. So we've got to start thinking about all those liberatory, I call them non-academic outcomes here. I now call them liberatory, right? How can they be liberatory? How can they help our students liberate themselves? The environment and the culture is really about the climate, right? The campus climate. What is your climate? Do people experience racial microaggressions? If they do, you're probably not an HSI and you probably need to address that. Community outcomes, how engaged are you with giving back to the community? Because guess what, if you're an HSI, the surrounding community reflects your student population because they come right from the surrounding community. So what are you doing to work with those communities for uplifting? Not for altruistic reasons, not for your own benefit, but for the community's benefit. The third aspect is membership. This is where in the new model, everything is about recruiting and retaining faculty and staff and board of trustees and everybody else, because we know the student population is already super diverse. So that's not even a question. We already know they are. But these are some numbers for faculty. And you all know, I don't have to tell you, we already know, even at HSIs, master's community colleges, or master's colleges, AKA your Cal States, are still predominantly white at the faculty level. Even Hispanic-serving community colleges. Francis Contreras published this article a couple years ago and found that even at the community colleges, still predominantly white. At the community colleges, where predominantly population is students of color, and the faculty are just not changing quick enough. We've got to change and we've got to address this. So yeah, the new model I'm addressing, how do we get there, right? How do we work towards these goals of like recruiting people who are committed to equity and justice and liberation, and not just saying we're recruiting people of color. We need to recruit people who are committed to the mission, because I'll give you a little secret, and this is again where the people of color in the audience go, not all people of color are committed to equity and justice. All right, let me get a couple even though I can't see you, because that's the reality. So we've got to be recruiting people who are committed to equity and justice, not just people of color, because some of those folks aren't committed to equity and justice and liberation. But that's because they need to spend some time, being liberated and getting some critical consciousness. So we want to have folks dealing with those and grappling with those things to help get to that point where you are committed to equity and justice. Governance. Oh, governance is like its own book. It's like 2 books. It could be multiple books because it's so complicated, but I'm going to tackle it in much bigger ways because the article doesn't capture it in significant ways, but I do basically say, hey, let's think about governance at multiple levels, right? Like, are you committed to equity and justice at your micro levels? This is those of you that are like faculty, coordinators, directors, micro levels, or what I would say on the ground. Are y'all committed to equity and justice? Some of the questions were like, how do we get, how do we transform the curriculum? Your faculty, your deans, or not the deans are next level, your faculty, your folks running programs, y'all are the ones that start at that level saying, we're committed to equity and justice. How do we do it better? Right? And realize you're probably not doing them that well because you've been committed to white normative standards all this time. And so we have to be really intentional about it. The next level is your institutional governance, your deans, your VPs, your presidents. Are they committed, or did they just write their statements? Right? Like, start looking at what are they doing, not just the statements that say we're committed to Black Lives Matter and anti-racism. What are they doing? Are they putting money into programs? Are they actually disaggregating data and helping you to realize where inequities are happening? Are they making decisions that are more focused on liberating students? I think we saw, recently when there was a sudden change in like the Trump administration says international students are going to have to basically, I guess, go away if they're not enrolled physically, right, for face-to-face versus online. And a bunch of institutions immediately were like, we've got to write a statement, we've got to push back, right? And I'm like, I wonder if they're doing that for equity and justice purposes, because we got presidents, VPs, deans, everybody like, no, we have to support international students. Are they doing that for equity and justice purposes, or are they doing that for their bottom line, right? Because we want international students because they bring in money to the institution. That's where we have to stop and have critical conversations about, why are we making these decisions? Why are we supporting students? Is it because we actually are committed to our international students and their equity and their liberation and their justice? Or is it just for our own benefit? Because equity and justice work has got to be for the liberation of the population, not just for your own benefit as an institution. The macro level is the governing systems, your state, your federal governing systems. California, I watch California very closely, obviously, because I'm from California, and the higher ed system there is so complex and you can learn so much from it. But also California is leading the way in a lot of things, right? So whatever California does, the rest of us should be doing, although we're not. Even though we've done problematic things in California, like banning affirmative action, although now we're seeing even that California's finally rethinking, right? Like, oh, wow, 20 years later, we see that elimination of affirmative action did actually have a negative impact on the enrollment of people of color in our most elite institutions. But those local, state, federal governance systems have got to be committed to equity and justice right along with the institution. Governance goals, leading, developing programs, curriculum, admitting students, monitoring budgets, ensuring policies, all that are grounded in justice and liberation. There's a lot of work and a lot of assessment we have to do against of our policies, right? And our policies, and are we actually committed to equity and justice based on what we're committed to at the policy level and in our decision making. I have a couple examples in here from my more recent book. Actually is an edited book, and it's published by Information Age Press. You can go on their website and check it out. Hispanic-Serving Institutions in Practice, Defining Servingness at HSIs. It's written by, there's 17 chapters written by HSI grant directors or grant coordinators. And so there's pretty amazing work in there because it's not coming from me, it's coming from the people on the ground who are actually doing this work. So UC Santa Cruz is doing pretty cool stuff, and they write about how they're leading for justice and how they have their entire institution and the governance system is committed to this, right? That they have these cross-functional teams that are talking about racial inequities. They talk about how they use Estela Ben-Simon's ideas of equity-mindedness, right? And how they disaggregate all their data in order to do this HSI work. So there's some good examples that we have of governance and really being committed to equity and justice at the governance system. Boundary management, in a nutshell, in an organizational model, is basically how you're dealing with all your external partners. And this is the part of the model that I'm really starting to think about now as I think about the next stage of my research is going towards boundary management, is how are we dealing with our board of trustees, our neighborhoods, our local governments, are they committed to the same work? My institution that I'm working with now is in Chicago. It's not the same institutions, whole new institutions, but back in Chicago. And they're in a much, they're not right smack in the city. They're actually up in like the suburbs, more of the suburbs of Chicago. And it's a pretty affluent area where they're located. And I've had people in the study talk about that our students have to deal with violence from the police as they leave like the city bus systems and the transit system, the train systems in Chicago. They get off and they enter this very affluent neighborhood, and suddenly they're having to deal with violence from the police, right? The local police, not even campus police. We've got to have those conversations with the communities to say, hey, Black and Latino people are coming to our campus and you can't be harassing them, right? Or at worst, killing them, right? We know that those kind of terrible things could happen to our students. We need to make sure that that's not happening. That's justice work. That's anti-racism work. It's like, we've got to talk to our local communities, our partners, even the neighbors, right? The neighbors in this affluent neighborhood that our HSI is in, they've got to be committed, and they've got to know that, yeah, students from the city, those students who are maybe undesirable and you think don't belong in your neighborhood, they actually do belong in the neighborhood because they're part of our institution. We've got to be managing those relationships with our external partners. Technology in an organizational model is the ways in which we turn inputs into outputs. And so this is where I focus primarily on curriculum and pedagogy and programs and services. And because I'm running out of time, I'm gonna go quickly through these. I'm not gonna talk about them. I have entire sessions on transforming the curriculum. And you know, you can definitely reach out to me if you're at an institution that would like to have that session at your institution. I'm open to doing that session, but that's a core conversation right now, is like, how do we transform technology or curriculum and programs to better serve our students? Incentive structure. Remember I talked about you got to incentivize faculty? Unfortunately, it's like the opposite of decolonizing, because in a decolonial model, people would do it because they are committed to equity and justice. And incentives are actually connected to a neoliberal model that we have to go after monetary outcomes in order to do this work. And so it's actually the opposite of decolonizing. Yet I also understand that people are driven externally in higher ed. So how do we do that? And I talked about my institution I'm working with now, you know, giving faculty small grants to do this work. And I would say, even go to the question that was earlier, not just faculty and staff, right? Like giving them small having an internal grant process where you say, okay, we're doing a call for teams that want to rethink how we can decolonize our structures. And your team has to have a faculty member and a staff member, and it has to be interdisciplinary. It's got to be across departments, and it's got to have a student. It's got to have a board of trustee. I don't know. You could get really creative, and incentivize them with a small grant, right, to do this work. It's an idea, and we got to be thinking about it. I'm not going to go through all of these things because that's why I talked about the internal grants. Justice and accountability is basically, how do you hold people accountable for injustices in HSIs? And I'll go right to this slide because I think the trending research topic right now, as somebody who follows HSI research, is racial microaggressions in HSIs. These are actually outdated. And you see, they're not that old, 2015 through 2017. There are articles that have been coming out in the last 2 years that are showing that students are continuing to experience microaggressions, and particularly starting to come out that, Black students are experiencing this, and students of other identities, not just your Latinx students, are still experiencing microaggressions at very high rates. So how do you hold people accountable for microaggressions? And I will tell you, spoiler alert, a lot of those come through in the classroom at the hands of faculty. So how do you hold your faculty accountable for not aggressing your students in the classroom? It's got to be addressed if you're going to be a decolonized or liberated HSI. Community standards is this idea that in a decolonial model, we would value Indigenous ways of knowing, and Indigenous ways of knowing value community. They don't actually value, Indigenous communities have historically made decisions as a community, not in a bureaucratic way. So something to think about is like, how do you actually decentralize your decision-making in a decolonial model? So that's the model in a nutshell. Like I said, I'm writing a whole book about it because there's so many things to be said about all these different aspects of the model. But I'm going to leave you there and let you ask questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garcia. This has been so rich. It's hard to even know where to start. And I've asked Dr. Christopher Newman to join me in kind of facilitating the questions with students. And I actually want to give him an opportunity to also respond, since he knows you and also does work in this area. So Christopher, I'm going to hand things over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you again. Thank you, Gina. And for all of you that are listening, just imagine for 2 years, this is the way Gina is normally. So this is not her presentation, Gina. This is the way Gina all the time. And I just enjoyed engaging with you and learning even in my own work and my own research. Now, there's been lots of changes. I mean, the world, I was asking my mother about this, this seems like the 60s, right? It seemed like things were just rapidly changing and there's just so much going on. And I think you're right in terms of thinking about how this is forefronted in a way where it was in the shadows for so long, and thinking about how are we thinking about curriculum, how are we thinking about structural diversity, how are we thinking about these things. And I think you're spot on. We have some students, questions from some of our students, and I want to sort of engage with you as we think about the curriculum. So first question is really looking at the AB 705, which eliminated remedial courses in English and math. And so do you think this is a step forward in decolonizing HSIs, or do you think AB 705 at the least a positive attempt in putting the needs of people of color at the center of community college admissions? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think critically about that. And even just going back to, like I said, my own experience in I won't call it remedial, I'll call it developmental math and English, is like, I actually went through developmental math and English in my first year in college, and I don't regret it. I was foundational and I did need it. And so I struggle with this one because I think that we have to also recognize. So one of the things I say is we have to embrace students how they show up, right? At HSIs, when they show up, if they are quote unquote unprepared for college, that the way to start thinking in a more asset-based rather than deficit is to say, cool, I wasn't ready for college when I arrived either. Let's get you ready, right? And put it into, I get the idea of having courses that don't count towards your degree. That's the problem, right? That they don't count towards the degree. So how do we as an institution own that and say, okay, well, how do we put that developmental material into the courses, which is the first course in the curriculum that would then be created or counted towards the degree. So I think we need to think a little more creatively rather than saying, let's eliminate developmental education, and or if you don't complete it, you have to go to the community college and you can't come back until you complete it, right? That is a deficit way of thinking, I think, and it puts the blame on the student, right? You better hurry up and do it, or you're not going to stay very long, versus us saying, we know they're going to show up needing these things. How do we provide it, and how do we provide it quicker? And maybe we provide it over the summer, like bridge programs have been doing forever, right? And bridge programs we know have been working forever. So why don't we just do that, right? There's other ways to think about it. So I think this could be a whole conversation, but that's my first immediate thoughts.
Excellent. Another question is really focusing around, because you talked a little bit about how do you sort of put your money, how do institutions put their money where their mouth is, so to speak. Do you have any sort of ideas or suggestions about someone who's really interested in looking at financial models and financial planning within institutions, and how they might be able to focus around equity, justice, and liberation as they're looking at sort of financial-based models and actual finances of that? And this comes from a student who's actually really interested in this, who's in accounting professor, and is interested in this.
Yeah, I think that for one, we need more research on that. So I think y'all have probably realized that I draw on research, right? Like, I'm not saying this stuff out of my head, although I do agree, believe these things, but I'm like, but this research shows us this, and research shows us that. So I think we actually need more research in that area. So whoever asked that and is doing this work, please do it, and please publish it and send it to me, and I will share it with people. But I do think we need to think about, like, the money where your mouth is. I mean, I think we agree, like, where you're putting funding into is what you value, right? There's a lot to say we're funding this thing that we actually value it. But I think we probably need to do a little more assessment of it, right? Like, actually do, what they call them, like diversity audits, right? Diversity audits are like one way to do it. And I have my EDD students that are like, I want to do a diversity audit. I'm like, okay, you got to audit everything. That's the problem, is that sometimes we don't audit everything. And we go right to the easiest things, which is like curriculum, right? Let's do a diversity audit of curriculum. Cool, we got to do that. But we should be doing a diversity audit of the finances, right? Where is the funding going? Or, like I keep saying, your board of trustees, what kind of decisions are they making? And let's do an audit of those, right? What are their most recent decisions that have been made that are coming out of the board of trustees? And are they grounded in anti-racism and really liberation for your students? So yes, I think yes, and please do that work and share it with me. For sure, I agree.
And I'm looking at the clock for the time, but I think there's another question that's a big question, but I think maybe it's just more about you unpacking a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Think about, can you speak a bit more to the paradox of decolonizing HSIs when championing mestizo populations might be construed as a continuation of Spanish colonization?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think this idea of decolonizing HSIs, in many ways, I struggle with it. Like, I'm like, I don't think that's, I don't know that we're ever going to actually get to that moment. I think it makes us think really critically, right? It does. It gets us thinking about, like, yeah, how are our students connected to this idea of settler colonialism and how we got here? Yet this is still happening, right? And it's not called settler colonialism. It's called imperialism, and it's called U.S. imperialism in many ways, right? We're doing this. We are continuing to reinforce us as the United States in many ways. And so, yeah, this is still happening, right? Imperialism is still happening. So we are now seeing an influx of indigenous people from Latin American countries and from Mexico coming to the United States, right? That is being documented, that we're seeing a rise in our indigenous Latinx populations, and also a rise in indigenous languages being used in the United States, which, guess what? They're going to be in HSIs very quickly. I actually just reviewed an ASH proposal, and it was about indigenous people in HSI, indigenous Latinx people at an HSI. And I'm like, yes, 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 yes. Please write this, and please let me read it, because we're going to have to start grappling with this. So I think it is a really complicated thing. And yeah, it's probably a whole nother webinar all on its own. And I'd love to engage in that conversation. So whoever sent that, feel free to reach out to me. Because it needs time. I need to think about it. And I will tell you, in the book that I keep talking about, the model, I'm actually not calling it decolonizing model. I'm just calling it transforming HSIs. Because I think that's at the core of the model, is really how do you transform for equity and justice without bringing in this really complex idea of decolonization, because it's super complex. And it needs to be handled in complex ways.
Right. And I think that leads to our last question. So as we think about then transforming an HSI and moving toward equity, justice, liberation, empowerment, often our students want to know what's an action they can take. But yeah. I think bigger than that, I want us to think together as a department and to say, as a Department of Higher Education that's putting professionals out into the field, what would be your parting words that you would have for us to say, here's how we should transform the work that we're doing in preparing professionals?
Yeah, for sure. I think, for one, being patient, right? Knowing that this does take time. But like I have been stressing with both presentations, and because I do this at an organizational level, is to understand that it is multidimensional, right? That it's not just one thing. You can't just do one thing. You've got to do multiple things, right? We think that if we hire more people of color, that's going to save us. And it's like, it's going to save us a little bit, but we still got to do more, right? Like it's a piece of the bigger puzzle. So I think thinking about all the ways in which we have to transform, and I think that's why people really vibe with the model, because it is like, yes, you got to change your composition. Yes, you got to change the way you deliver education. Yes, you have to change where you're putting your money. Yes, you have to change how decisions are being made, right? We need to decentralize and decenter the bureaucracy of higher ed, right? Yes, 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 we need to address microaggressions. Yes, faculty and white faculty need to be trained to not be racist and not be microaggressive in the classroom, right? Yes, yes, yes to all of those things. So yeah, I think I would say in parting is to remember it's long-term and it's organizational and it's multidimensional. So be patient with yourself, but start doing more than, I know there's like a trend in like book clubs right now. I love the book clubs, but then what next, right? Like, okay, read a book, but like, how are we going to start moving towards action? Because action has got to happen. And we're at this pivotal moment right now in US history where we're allowed to take action that is centered on a lot of the things I'm saying. And I say allowed because everybody seems to be really committed to it, right? So let's take advantage and run with it.
Thank you so much. I think those are really good parting words to think we are at a pivotal moment when we are empowered to make the kinds of changes that you've suggested. You've given us good, rich insights that we'll continue to think about and talk about. I think your words to start now and know that you're in it for the long haul, using multiple approaches and focusing on organizational change. That's certainly where we hope to be as a department and is our goal. And we so appreciate the time you've taken today to join us and to further us along that goal. For those of you who've been participating, we have recorded the session, and we'll also have Gina's slides available through the presentation. So we'll be in touch with you. If you registered for the webinar, then we'll be back in touch with you with some of those resources. Thank you so very, very much, Dr. Garcia. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gina.
You're welcome.